Hello, and welcome to our special retro edition podcast, How Not to Be a Nazi, Part 2, The Politics. In Part 1, I told you about a Nazi soldier who returned to Germany to find, to his horror, that the Allied propaganda was true, and he was one of the baddies. Then I posed a question to myself, and by extension to you. Could I live with it if I acted to affect things that I believed were wrong, and it turned out that I was one of the baddies, especially when lives are at stake? Could I live with being remembered as the goose-stepping monster that future generations watched in horror? Would my soul be soothed enough by knowing that I had acted from ignorance and not malice? Though the information was available, but unexamined, because I trusted others? We've covered the timeline of Israel's history. Now, here's the politics. After the October 7th massacre, Israel declared war to ensure that Hamas could never commit these atrocities again. Hamas continues to state its intentions to repeat these horrors, quote, 100 times over. Israel began firing on Gaza, targeting Hamas, while broadcasting messages to the civilians, displaying maps of the areas that would be targeted and the areas that were safe. Egypt closed the passage out of Palestine and refused to accept Palestinian refugees, as have other nearby Arab nations. Israel left the power and water on in South Gaza, but turned it off in North Gaza to encourage civilians to move south where the utilities were still available, in order to separate Hamas from the civilian populations. There were conflicting reports as to whether Hamas was actively preventing people who were trying to leave from doing so and using them as human shields. Aerial photographs of Hamas setting up blockades on roads to the south with enormous traffic jams stretching behind them seems to confirm that Hamas is indeed holding its own people hostage. But there are also reports from Palestinians denying this. Phone calls of Israeli military have been released where you can hear them trying to persuade Palestinians to evacuate buildings that are about to be targeted, pleading with them to think of their children. And they received replies that their own children's death will provide good propaganda for the cause. The media showed footage of a Palestinian man crying in a hospital, but not the footage of the same man only hours before, filming Palestinian rockets firing on Israel as he celebrated. Undoubtedly, it's not as fun to be around when they fire back, but that hardly makes him an innocent victim. Nor were two women in Islamic veil and dress mourning the devastation around them, having appeared heavily armed in Hamas battle gear in a prior video. Israel promised to restore power and water upon the return of the 240-plus hostages. There was a public outcry that Israel should immediately restore water and power for the sake of the civilians, which Hamas continues to endanger. But as of yet, there have been no large-scale calls for Hamas to take responsibility and end the suffering of its people by doing what they should do regardless: return the hostages and surrender to the justice of international tribunals. There are many civilian casualties in Gaza, including children and young adults. Many people blame Israel for continuing to try to eliminate Hamas given the civilian casualties. Others argue that the Geneva Convention states that the side that hides among the civilians is the party that's responsible for their deaths. Several Palestinian health organizations reported that Israel hit a hospital in the Gaza Strip, resulting in over 500 deaths. And the media quoted this as though it were fact, touting it all over the world. These organizations work under Hamas, and journalists confirmed long before this conflict that Hamas does censor what they say. They also have a long record of making false claims, which caused some to doubt them from the start. This view was reinforced when video and independent analysis by the United States determined that the hospital was actually struck by one of Palestine's rockets, which were clearly being fired on Israel at the time. In the video, the hospital itself was apparently not even hit. It was the parking lot that was struck. It was hard to confirm the number of casualties caused by Hamas's rockets, but European investigators estimate the casualties to be in the dozens, as opposed to 500, which is no comfort to the families of those who have been lost, I'm sure. At this point, I would like to point out that this article was written in January, so recent events will not be included, including recent updates. And there have been countless events like this one, where the media took a story from Hamas, reported it as though it was fact, and if they ever corrected them, it was very buried, briefly mentioned updates that almost always proved the story to be either entirely or mostly false. I'll complete the unfolding story in the finale, but for now, if you can handle it, part 2 of 3 is questioning the politics. So the first question, how much land are we disputing over here? And what about a two-state solution? Arab Muslim countries cover a massive percentage of the globe's land. Over 50 countries are Muslim and 20 of those are Arab, most of which are large and oil-rich. Israel is 8,367 square miles of land. 8,550 if you count bodies of water. In some places, it's only 9 miles wide. It is 261 miles long by 71.5 miles wide at its widest point. It has no oil. For comparison, the state of New Jersey is 7,353 square miles of land, 8,721 in total. So New Jersey has more water, but it's roughly the same size as Israel. Jordan was originally promised to be part of Israel, but it was set aside as a country for the local Arabs instead. It is 34,495 square miles. So the state created for the local Arabs when Israel was created for the local Jews is 4 times the size of Israel, and it was also by far the better quality land at the time. We have been talking about a two-state solution as though it is a new idea for my entire life. But a two-state solution was already tried. The Palestinian state is called Jordan. It didn't work before. Why should we think it would work to repeat it now? It is past time for a new idea. Question number 2. Did the policies of the USA contribute to recent events? Obama's policies strengthened Iran. So many of the Arab states that had formerly insisted on the policy of the 3 no's began to see Iran as a bigger threat than their objection to Israel. States that had previously made war on Israel were willing to come to the table and truly negotiate for the first time at the Abraham Accords. Biden's policies provided support to the terrorist branches of the Palestinian government and freed up access to large amounts of money for Iran, greatly destabilizing this process. Obama's concessions were supposed to lead to a more moderate Iran. This hope proved entirely baseless when no moderates emerged, much less rose to power. The funds released to Iran were used to spread terror, and we have seen indirect conflicts emerge between Iran and Saudi Arabia, especially over control of oil-rich Yemen as a result. The Iranian Houthis restored slavery, caused much death, and seized control of one of the world's shipping bottlenecks, thereby doubling shipping costs for goods throughout the world. The Trump administration had pursued a radical policy in separating the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from the Israeli-Arab conflict, and in so doing, brought about the Abraham Accords. The understanding during these negotiations was that the United States was not going to negotiate when it came to three things: Israel's right to exist, its sovereignty over the Golan Heights, the forfeiting of which was taken off the table as a possible concession, and Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, which was also non-negotiable. On the clear understanding that we stood firm on these issues, the discussions of a peaceful alliance between Israel and its neighbors began being discussed. When Biden came to office, he decided to undo everything without any policy reasons beyond simply establishing his administration as an anti-Trump force. He turned on Saudi Arabia and freed up finances for Iran and Palestine. He also delisted terrorist groups while they were still firing on American troops. His policies led directly to a green light for the Third Gazan War in 2021. Biden recently added a pledge of $100 million in aid to Palestine, though his own staff publicly acknowledges that they have no real way to stop Hamas from being the recipients of that aid. The deputy NSA director could only defend the plans with claims of having a, quote, understanding with Hamas fighters who control the checkpoints on the other side of the border, unquote. That figure, just as a side note, does not include the $30 million we spent to build a pier there was no need for that is now breaking apart and floating around in the Mediterranean. Money that, people around here could use. Matt Miller of the State Department said Israel was concerned that, quote, any assistance that goes in would be diverted once inside Gaza. The people with guns inside Gaza are Hamas, and so Hamas may try to divert this assistance and keep it from getting to the civilians it is intended for. We think that is a legitimate concern. We've made it clear that this aid needs to go to innocent civilians and not Hamas. We're going to be watching very carefully. Clearly, there is no plan beyond trusting Hamas's scouts on her promise and watching through binoculars as they carry out whatever theft they choose to, and then arranging for the next shipment. And that is exactly what has happened repeatedly. Biden also expressed his deep concern that Islamophobia would be perpetrated by Americans on fellow Americans. Only one act, vile and horrific as it was, a man stabbing a Palestinian neighbor woman and repeatedly stabbing her 6-year-old son to death, was committed. While multiple anti-Israel protests calling for and even perpetrating acts of violence against Jews were not addressed as a similar concern for the president, despite 1,300 Jews having been massacred, with over 100 missing, and the fate of 240 plus hostages, 30 of which are toddlers, remains unknown. Again, I will remind you, these statistics are from January. All over the USA, these protests called for participation in a worldwide day of jihad in solidarity with Hamas. At another protest, a 69-year-old Jewish counter-protester had his head beat in by a pro-Palestinian and died as a result. The media merely reported with the headline that he, quote, died at the protest, as though by an accident or of natural causes. People trying to enter the Museum of Remembrance, a Holocaust museum, were also attacked and beaten. Yet, many of these groups continue to receive public support, including officials of prominent universities such as MIT and Harvard. One example of this support was a UC Davis college assistant professor of American Studies, also a faculty advisor, Gemma DeCristo, who publicly posted an incitement to violence, pointing out protesters' quote, easy access to the quote, Zionist journalist in the media, declaring, quote, they have houses with addresses, kids in school, and threatening, quote, they can fear their bosses, but they should fear us more. She concluded her post with 5 emojis, a knife, an axe, and 3 drops of blood. This is a professor at a college, a faculty advisor. There was also an insurrection in Washington, D.C. on the 18th of October that received little media coverage, videos of which showed over 300 protesters barging into the Capitol and disrupting the business of elected officials to, quote, represent the terrorist groups they supported. Indeed, some of the more radical members of the government itself, including members of Congress, such as AOC of New York, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, have publicly come out in favor of the protesters and of Palestine, even, quote, justifying Hamas's attack and voicing their support. Yet Biden's focus has remained on his concern for potential, though presently unrealized, backlash of Islamophobia. Powerful organizations also came out in full support of Palestine and or Hamas, identifying themselves openly as anti-Israel and in some cases openly even as anti-Jew. Black Lives Matter, for example, publicly sided with the terrorist. Not just Palestine, the terrorist. Even publicizing a new slogan of theirs which depicted a terrorist on a hang glider, referencing the shooters who attacked the Israeli Music Festival, which is the only connection between Palestinians and hang gliding. Environmental groups, led by former child activist Greta Thunberg, have also joined in, which is interesting given Palestine's massive pollution problem, which is both harmful to the environment and to nearby historic sites. A subsect of the LGBTQ, calling themselves Queers for Palestine, also voiced their support, seemingly oblivious to the irony that they would literally be thrown from rooftops to their deaths if they lived in Palestine, where their murder wouldn't even be considered a crime. Feminist groups came out as well, despite the terrible sexual violence committed against women, both during the attack and to hostages. There remains a definite contradiction between a commitment to, quote, believe all women and a refusal to believe these Jewish women. There are some who question or even deny the sexual assaults that happened on October 7th, and these denials are about as credible as denials of the Holocaust itself. There is the evidence of survivors, as in hostages who have been returned. There is the evidence of the corpses who have been examined, many of which were raped so violently that their pelvises were broken. There is video footage. There is video footage that Hamas supplied. There are the pamphlets that Hamas agents carried, instructing them to rape. There is the testimony out of the mouth of Hamas perpetrators themselves. I don't really know what evidence there could be of any kind that shows rape that does not exist in this case. Those who are denying this are doing a vile thing. I'll cut to the chase. Far from being an apartheid government, Israel has a 20% Arab population. It has an Arab political party. It has had several of them in the past. It has Arabs serving in its government, including on the Supreme Court, and in its military, and holds regular elections. There have been a wide variety of prime ministers and leaders, like any democracy would have over time, some of which you may like and some of which you may hate, just like every other democracy. So what is apartheid? Simply put, segregation. It means apartness and is defined as a policy or system of segregation, political, social, or economic discrimination on the grounds of race. The best example of this is South Africa, which enforced policies of strict racial segregation and criminalized having biracial children. No such policies, legal or otherwise, exist in Israel, where 1 in 5 people are Arabs, who often fiercely defend their country as a small spot of freedom in a very intolerant part of the world. The Palestinian territories, on the other hand, can truly be called apartheid by its very definition, especially Gaza, as it has only held one election since Israel pulled out in 2005. It elected its leaders for a 4-year term by putting 3 terrorist organizations into power, and there has yet to be another free election. There are no Jews living in Gaza, much less serving as part of its government. In fact, there are giant signs warning Jews who approach the border that if they cross into Palestinian territory, they will be killed. These warnings have proven accurate in the past, when Jewish people with mental disabilities wandered into Palestine and were murdered. The hostility is also reflected in the situation over the Temple Mount. Muslims have had control of the Temple Mount since 1967, when Israel won the entire Old City of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, but voluntarily turned the mound over to Muslim control as a gesture of goodwill. Despite the temple being 1,600 years older than the entire religion of Islam. Since that time, Jews have not been allowed to pray or have religious freedom on the Temple Mount, whereas Muslims are given absolute free reign, despite the much-rumored, though non-existent, restrictions that are constantly alluded to, but never specified. There's a reason they're never specified. They're non-existent. Throughout Israel, Muslims stop in public, exit their cars in the street, etc., to kneel and pray at the required times of the day, and do so unmolested by the Jews around them. Congregations of more than 100,000 Muslims have gathered on the Temple Mount on Muslim holidays, while only a single Jew is allowed to pray there one time each year, on the place that was the center of their historic kingdom and remains the center of their religion for 1,600 years before Islam even came to be. So, who are the ones behaving like colonizers? One really must ask if most of the politicians and activists who use these terms in this context say colonizer, but actually mean whoever looks the whitest, or whoever is more Western, as opposed to a literal reference to the indigenous versus the invader, in any historic sense. The only other explanation for the repeated use of the words colonizer and apartheid would be if they are using words that they don't know what they mean. This issue of access to the Temple Mount has been used by Hamas and Fatah to commit violence. In 2021, terrorists used the site they claimed to hold sacred to throw large rocks at the Jewish police from inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israeli police were finally forced to put a stop to it, at which point their invasion of the mosque was used as a pretext for Palestine to begin launching rockets at Israel, which is how the Third Gazan War began. Here is how the media covered that day. While portraying Israelis as brutal zealots dragging innocent men from their places of worship for no reason, they added a spin on world history too. WIOnews.com's headline ran similar to many others. Quote, "Across the world, Muslims consider the Al-Aqsa Mosque as their third holiest place. The controversial mosque compound overlooks the Western Wall, which is considered a sacred place by Jews. They specify in detail that the mosque is the third most holy site for Muslims worldwide. And you won't believe the shock of what you'll find out about that in Part 3. While in the same sentence, they label the Western Wall as simply a sacred place to Jews. The factual truth, which even Muslims acknowledge, is that this is the number one sacred place to Jews and Judaism anywhere in the world, a site that predates the entire Muslim religion by 1.5 millennia. To put that into a bit of perspective, since numbers can often become meaningless, Islam was founded 1400 years ago, in the 600s, the Dark Ages. And we are, in the age of computers and spaceships, still 200 years closer to the founding of Islam, basically the entire existence of the United States as a country, than it is to the construction of the temple 1600 years before that. Is this type of presentation by the media an unintentional accident rather than bias? What about when the BBC reported Israelis were shooting Arab doctors in the Gaza hospital when the story actually ran, as they later admitted, Israelis provide Arab doctors in a Gazan hospital to ensure communication of what was happening to the Palestinian patients? How much faith in their motives or competence do you feel the press has earned on any subject in recent years? How much benefit of the doubt are you willing to extend to them? Or their ongoing biased coverage of this subject? The other pretext, aside from the violence at the mosque for the Third Gazan War of 2021, is even more strange. It was a dispute over a suburb of Jerusalem. Prior to Jordanian control, Jews had bought homes and lived in this suburb with legal property deeds. When Jordan began occupying Jerusalem, the Jews were not allowed to return to those homes. During this time, new Arab owners moved in. Some were able to obtain deeds from Jordan, but some people living in these homes didn't bother to obtain new property deeds. After the 1967 war, Israel won back this suburb of Jerusalem. And now there were two owners for each home. We Westerners might have said, "Tough luck, get out. Your legal deed is preempted by this prior legal deed." But the Israelis didn't do that. They acknowledged that under Jordan, those Arabs had legally acquired deeds in good faith and had lived there for years. They ruled that the new owners would retain the property at the Jewish owner's loss. As for the Arab occupants who did not have legal Jordanian deeds to the homes that they had lived in rent-free, and only in cases where the previous owners still had their legal deeds, it was ruled that the person with the deed owned the house over the person with no deed. But wait, even then, the Israeli courts did not rule that the people currently living there could be evicted. The Israeli courts gave them the right to remain in those homes, which they had no legal claim to, alongside the Arabs who did have Jordanian deeds. The only difference was the condition that they had to pay rent to the people that owned the house. Those owners were given no choice besides selling about becoming landlords. They were not given the option to live in the homes that they owned. So, what could possibly be the problem with a ruling that generous? Well, years later, the Jewish owners who held the deeds to 4 of these properties decided that they would like to knock down their 4 homes and put up an apartment building. The Arab occupants, who had no deeds from either government and were still allowed to live there on the condition that they started to pay rent, had never complied or paid any rent. But they objected to the plan for the apartments. The Israeli courts eventually rightly ruled that their non-payment of rent for over 50 years legally justified their eviction, which would allow plans for the apartment building to move forward. But, in the interest of justice, any actual evictions would be delayed, and the ruling would not be put into effect until the matter could be heard by the Supreme Court, where an Arab judge sits. Hamas took this ruling over 4 homes, which was not even final, and declared that it was ethnic cleansing of the suburb. A claim which is absolutely absurd, given that all of the rent-paying Arabs were allowed to stay, along with all the non-rent-paying Arabs who had Jordanian deeds to the homes and were now the owners. Still, these 4 potential evictions, which were more than justified by rent laws anywhere in the world, combined with the incited, quote, assault on the mosque, were the grounds given to the world as proof of Israeli aggression and their active ethnic cleansing. So I hope next time you hear claims of ethnic cleansing, these type of words, you remember this story and take it with a grain of salt. Before waiting for the Supreme Court to even hear the case, Palestinians began launching rockets at Israel. Most of the world's media recycled one side of the story, ironically while claiming they were doing so to set the virtuous example of telling the untold side, without bothering to tell the implied told side of the story. They also appeared to make no distinction in how you should treat 2 versions of a story if, after some digging, one story proves true and the other one is discovered to be a total manipulation of the facts. Question number 4. Who is the government for Palestinians? It took me a while to sort out that there are some common authorities between the West Bank and Gaza and some more localized ones. Assad runs the PLO, an open terrorist group, as covered in part 1 of this series. He was elected for 4 years, 19 years ago, and has refused to follow through on promises to hold free elections ever since. Presumably because polls show that Hamas would win in a landslide. This is the same man President Biden spoke to when he pledged $100 million of aid to the Palestinian Authority, a terrorist organization that has paid out over $3 million in pensions to the families of suicide bombers, and a group that openly pays bounties on Jews to people just like the perpetrators of October 7th, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It pays these bounties as official government payments in a pay-for-slay policy that is written into legal law. They also put out an official document to all mosques under their control with instructions for Friday, October 20th services, where they were to recite the quote attributed to Muhammad along with other anti-Semitic propaganda, which reads, quote, "The hour will not come until Muslims fight the Jews and the Muslims kill them. And the Jew hides behind the stones and the trees, and the stones and the trees say, 'O Muslim, O servant of Allah, this is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.'" Assad and the PLO lost control of Gaza a year after they were elected, when Hamas was put into power and killed all the members of the PLO in Gaza. The PLO continues to exist in the West Bank. So Hamas, a terrorist organization, and Islamic Jihad, a terrorist organization, are the main governments of Gaza, along with Fatah, a terrorist group, which is the military wing of the Palestinian Authority. Fatah is also the group responsible for the children's television programming that is seen in Palestine. If you only watch one video out of all the ones I have described in this series, I would urge you to choose a sample of Palestinian children's programming or a video of recent Palestinian kindergarten graduations. Simply enter those in the search at YouTube. The programming is geared toward the same age groups as Sesame Street and animated Disney movies. I would like to stress that, like the October 7th footage, I have watched clips of these shows with my own eyes, and what I describe are things that I saw for myself. These shows depict animated hero characters, puppet characters, and kindly Mr. Rogers type roles. However, these characters all extol the virtues of various suicide bombers. They lead the children in worshipful chants about the explosives themselves, revering the, quote, blood they spray. These children's characters encourage the toddler-age viewers to shed blood, to stab, or drive over Jews, often acting out these acts while indoctrinating cradle-aged toddlers with the idea that Jews are evil in their very nature and vermin or pigs. Quite unsettling for government children's programming. Not exactly PBS. The kindergarten graduation is equally disturbing. Watching the round baby faces of 5-year-olds in costume battle gear with AK-47s in their hands, acting out little skits where they hunt down and kill a classmate playing the role of a Jew. Not exactly a school production of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. This type of constant indoctrination leads to commonplace children games, such as Stab the Jew, in which a designated Jew walks into an ambush where the other kids act out stabbing him to death and running away. This eventually graduates to camps designed for training children in actual combat. These children, who appear to be as young as 9 or 10 up through teenagers, receive training in lethal attacks on Jews and in firing AK-47s. These are the groups in official government in Palestine. Yet you will commonly hear from the few who are willing to admit that these groups are what these groups say they are. You will hear arguments that the average Palestinian is different. And isn't that fair? I'm sure some of them are. But you must also keep in mind that these terrorists were elected to Palestinian power, which, based on the very concept of elections, means that the majority of Palestinian voters chose them knowing who they were. All polls, even after October 7th, and despite the suffering that the common people currently endure as a result, show more than 70% approval ratings among the Palestinians for both Hamas and the October 7th attack. And why would that surprise anyone? How will that ever change if terrorists are left in charge and allowed to continue indoctrinating future generations from the cradle? As for the argument that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, in light of the information provided, I'll have to leave that up to you as far as how valid you find that argument. I'll provide my own thoughts on that soon. We covered an example of, quote, ethnic cleansing Such accusations are truly hard to support given how much the Palestinian population has actually grown since 1948. There are presently 10 times as many Palestinians right now as there were then. So either it's not happening, or the Jews are really bad at it. And having been victims of it on multiple occasions, you would have to assume they know how it's done. But ethnic cleansing would be an entirely accurate term to use for what happened to the Jewish population in Arab countries during that same time period. In Morocco, in 1948, there were around 265,000 Jews. By 2018, that number was a mere 2,150. Libya went from having a population of 38,000 Jews to 0. Over the same years, Iraq went from 135,000 to less than 10. Not 10,000, 10. Algeria saw a reduction from 140,000 Jews to less than 50. Again, that's not 50,000, that's 50. Egypt went from 75,000 Jews to 100, while Yemen went from a population of 63,000 to less than 50. Tanzania went from 105,000 to 1,050. Syria went from 30,000 to 100. Lebanon went from 5,000 to less than 100. So, if you're doing the math, in 1948, there were 856,000 Jews living in these 9 Arab countries alone. And by 2018, that was down to less than 3,610 Jews. If a purging of at least 852,390 Jews qualifies in your mind as ethnic cleansing, then these Arab states are the perpetrators. The bottom line is that the most powerful words used to argue about this issue are based on complete ignorance of the verifiable statistics. And those stats confirm that it is not just Jews who have been cleansed from Arab countries. Christian communities have been targeted too, along with other minorities, including Muslim minorities. This fate has befallen Christians in countries like Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. In Nigeria, Muslim organizations, and I say Muslim instead of Arab because they are religious groups, as defined by themselves, have actually murdered thousands of Christians. 2 million Christians have been forced to flee Iraq as refugees in the past 2 decades alone, during a time when America had an active presence there. And millions of Muslims have been deported from Pakistan recently. What did the world do about all of this? Although there are many refugees of all races, religions, and origins throughout the world, the UN has only 2 agencies dedicated to the world's refugees. The first is for refugees everywhere. And the second, UNRWA, is exclusively for Palestinian refugees who have been living in stone cities for decades, not refugee camps or tents like the rest of the world's refugees. It is the only UN organization dedicated to just one group of people. And they bear the brunt of the responsibility for the indoctrination that goes on in Palestine. It has also been uncovered that they participated both in October 7th and in holding hostages, including children hostages, as well as other atrocities like hiding the bodies of some of these hostages. That would be the UN organization UNRWA. Number 5. Isn't it a war crime for Israel to cut off the water and power to Gaza? Despite the fact that the Gaza Strip is independent and therefore not Israel's responsibility, for 18 plus years, Israel has been providing completely free of charge power and water to them for years. They are not legally obligated to do this, so they are not legally obligated to continue doing this. Gaza should be using the aid it receives for the purposes that it's sent for, like infrastructure instead of terrorist tunnels. War crimes involving civilians are outlined in the Geneva Convention, which clearly spells out that fighters who hide among civilian populations or use civilians as human shields are the ones responsible for the war crime, not the opposing army that continues to fight despite the civilian deaths. I'm not attempting to address the morality or killing that goes on in war, or the value of human life. I don't like war. I don't like seeing any of these casualties. I am only addressing the argument of what actually qualifies as a war crime and not what qualifies as right or wrong. Hamas, on the other hand, has actually stolen aid from their own people. The Palestinian Authority itself posted a report that Hamas stole aid intended for the people from the PA. They quickly removed the post, probably out of fear of retaliation by Hamas. And again, the Palestinian Authority are terrorists too, and even they accuse Hamas. If that wasn't enough, footage of the Hamas tunnels showed stockpiles of aid, food, and medicine, which they demand more of because the people they had abandoned above ground are dying without it. There is also footage of multiple shipments of aid, delivered in many cases by Jews at great risk to themselves, being stolen by Hamas. The rockets that Palestine fires at Israel are supplied by Iran, who was basically broke until Biden released funds to them, financing their attacks on various neighbors. Our own sinking economy and massive national debt aside, how many terrorist groups do we want to fund in the name of aid? Either way, the intended civilians are not getting it. Maybe it's time to change Biden's policy of funding terrorists as a form of appeasement or sending millions in aid based on the broken promises of terrorists. We might also want to repeal the Biden-led vote of 2021, where 200 Democrats refused to place any sanctions on companies that give donations to or do business directly with Hamas itself. I don't mean Palestine, I mean Hamas itself. Number 6. Is there not at least a less violent way than this? The Iron Dome system of Israel allows them to fire anti-missiles whenever its radar detects rockets being fired at Israel. Due to Israel's small size and close proximity to Gaza, the warning time from the time that Gaza fires on them until the rockets reach its target is between 15 and 90 seconds. Despite this small window, the Israeli system is able to detect the danger, calculate where the rocket is headed, calculate a collision point, and fire the anti-missile to intercept the threat. The system strikes down enemy rockets with a 90% success rate. The Iron Dome is the main protection against mass casualties among Israelis. But it often goes unnoticed that it also makes lesser aggression towards Palestine even possible, avoiding civilian casualties there as well. Without this effective system, Israel's main cities would be hit regularly, and mass casualties would take place every time Gaza fired rockets over the border, which happens regularly. If that were the situation, Israel would have no choice but to unleash full-scale warfare via their air force and destroy Gaza's ability to attack them. This is also true of the Palestinian terrorist group Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Their weapons are far more advanced than Hamas's, and their terrorist group is much larger. If Israel was left with no choice besides being annihilated or full-scale warfare, we could quickly see the start of World War III, which is why the United States needs to stand firm in its position that no interference will be tolerated, which we have not done. Again, I remind you, this was written in January. Israel could have saved itself any further casualties after October 7th if it used its air force to destroy the threat. by disregarding civilians. But it stopped the airstrikes early and sent in ground troops, knowing that more of their own troops would die as a result in order to save Palestinian lives. They broadcast safe zones. They called buildings that were about to be hit. Even the power is clearly not fully out, given that the Palestinian civilians have functioning cell phones months later that have to be charged somewhere. Yet the consensus is that Israel must do more. But no one says what more they can do apart from turning their backs on the hostages, leaving Hamas in power, still fully committed to annihilating Jews from the entire earth, consider all the dead on both sides as having died for nothing, and go home and wait for the next massacre. And then start all over for a sixth time. We hear about how the, quote, open-air prison that is Gaza drove them to this, mentioning the restrictions on their coming and going, even on shipments of fish that they bring back. But what other way can Israel even reduce the weapons shipments into Gaza? If the Palestinian people would elect governments that were committed to peace, these restrictions could eventually end. But those they elect stockpile supplies that the everyday people die for lack of. The leaders attack, then refuse to shelter their people from the consequences, while they hide in their tunnels built with international aid. Then they openly tell the world that their own civilians aren't their responsibility. It's up to the world to provide for the common people. The, quote, open-air prison argument is very hard to support in the first place, given that Israel doesn't surround Gaza. Egypt borders one wall of this prison, a wall it refuses to allow any Palestinians through, while Israel, who's at a far greater risk, allows them to come and go via work visas, which was repaid by these workers spying for Hamas and helping to plan October 7th. Number 7. Isn't it fair to argue that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter? No. Sorry to be so blunt, but those who quote a Bond villain as though he's a good example, I'll answer them with Bond's comeback. They aren't freedom fighters if they aren't fighting for freedom. Hamas is crystal clear. They aren't fighting for freedom. They aren't even fighting for land. They aren't fighting for rights or a two-state solution. According to them, they are fighting, I repeat that, according to them, they are fighting to exterminate the Jews as a country, and then from the region, meaning the Middle East, and then from the world. They specify that in their charter. That is their goal as an organization, to eliminate the Jews from the planet. That's their reason for being, according to them, in their charter, plain and simple. To support them is to support that. There is no way around that. This is not simply my opinion of their mission, it's their opinion of their mission. It's not something said by a single random Hamas operative. It's what all of their leaders say in their interviews and statements, even in writing. In fact, the only people who say this is about anything else are Westerners. And most of them, while anxious to chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, don't even know which river or sea they're talking about, or what their chant actually means, and that it's a call for genocide. By the way, it's the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, meaning all of Israel, and it's a call to purge the land of all, quote, subhuman Jews via absolute racial genocide. It's a calling for the exact same thing that the Nazis called for. So don't say it if you aren't prepared to go down in history as having meant it. Is that really a chant you want to support when you stop and think about it? And if it is, How is it in any way different from being a Nazi? That concludes part 2, the politics. All right, the finale, part 3, is coming up. This is the big one. Consider yourselves forewarned. I thank you for tuning in today, and I hope you are enjoying these retroactive podcasts in order to catch up the articles I was doing before I got the podcast going. And I hope I will see you next week.